It's funny, isn't it? You hear people say their memory's going, or maybe they can't run as fast, but you almost never hear someone say, I just don't feel as smart as I used to. It's like a weird thing to admit.
That's a really great way to start. It touches on this idea that maybe intelligence is just fixed, or at least, doesn't change like other things we notice.
Right.
But the research, well, it paints a much more complicated and I think a really fascinating picture.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, you've pulled together some amazing material, mostly drawing from Ian Deary's book, Intelligence.
That's the one.
It's a really thorough look at this. And our goal today is basically to unpack it. What intelligence really is, how we even try to measure it.
And all the things that affect it through life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we want to do it without getting totally bogged down in jargon. Think of it as like your shortcut to understanding the science here.
Precisely. And having a comprehensive source like Deary's book lets us dig into the nuances, see the bigger patterns beyond just single studies.
Okay, let's jump right in then. What are we actually talking about when we say intelligence? It feels like it could mean almost anything.
You're spot on. It's broad. And pinning down one single definition, that's one of the first big hurdles in the research.
Right.
Deary points out that even everyday words like smart or clever, they're pretty vague. People mean different things. And we all know someone who's maybe brilliant at math, but say terrible at remembering names, right?
Totally.
So the question becomes, are some people just generally better across the board, at lots of different mental tasks, simply more intelligent?
And that leads us to this concept of G, doesn't it? That seems pretty central.
It really is. G. It stands for general cognitive ability. It came from Charles Spearman, noticing that, people who do well on one kind of mental test
tend to do well on others too.
Basically, yes. It's like there's some underlying general capacity that affects performance on all sorts of cognitive tasks.
So if you're good at, say, understanding complicated instructions, you're probably also better at visual puzzles, something like that.
Generally, yeah. And it's not just a Western thing. There was that big study by Warren and Birmingham.
Oh, yeah.
Across 31 non-Western nations. Huge data set. Over 50,000 people. They found strong evidence for G2. It accounted for something like 46% of the differences in test scores. Pretty universal.
Wow, 46%. That's significant. But didn't someone, Thurstone, wasn't it? Didn't he have a different take initially?
That's right, yeah. Back in the 30s, Thurston talked about 7 primary mental abilities. Things like verbal comprehension, spatial skills.
Yeah.
He initially argued these were mostly separate, downplaying G. But then when his own data got reanalyzed... Well, they found positive correlations between his 7 abilities, so even his work kind of ended up pointing back towards G.
So the evidence for G just kept building up over time.
It really did. By the 1940s, it was becoming pretty clear. Give people a bunch of different mental tests, and the scores tend to hang together positively.
Yeah.
It really solidified G as a robust concept. And then John Carroll, in his massive 1993 book, he pulled together decades of this research.
And that's where his 3-strata model fits in. Sounds like a hierarchy.
Exactly. Think of it like a pyramid. At the very top, the 3rd stratum, you've got G, general intelligence.
Okay.
Then the middle layer, the 2nd stratum, has about 8 broad cognitive abilities. Things like fluid reasoning, processing speed. Some of these map onto the domains measured by tests, like the WAIS.
Right, the Wechsler scale we'll get.
Yeah. And then the bottom layer, the 1st stratum, that's where you find very specific skills, pretty much like the individual subtests on an IQ test.
So general ability at the top, influencing broader skills, which then influence really specific tasks. Makes sense.
Precisely. But it's super important to remember, like Deary stresses G in these domains, they're statistical ideas.
Not actual lumps in the brain.
Exactly. They're just the best way we found so far to describe the patterns we see in how people score on different tests.
Okay, got it. So how do we actually go about measuring this G and these different abilities? You mentioned the WAIS 4.
Yes, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition. It's probably the most widely used individual intelligence test for adults.
And it's quite involved, right? Not just a quick online quiz.
Definitely not. It's one-on-one, takes a few hours usually. The person sits down with a trained examiner and goes through 15 different subtests.
15. Wow. Can you give a feel for what some of those are like?
Sure. So there's similarities where you might be asked, how are an apple and a pear alike? Or maybe something harder like, how are a painting and a symphony alike?
Okay, testing abstract thinking.
Exactly. Vocabulary tests word knowledge, from easy words to really obscure ones. Then there's digit span.
Ah, memory tests.
Yeah, but specifically working memory. You hear a string of numbers, then you have to repeat them back, either forwards or
Backwards. Ooh, that sounds tough.
backward digit span is definitely tricky. You have to hold the numbers and mentally reverse them. Really taxes that working memory system.
I bet. What else?
Then you have the speeded tests, things like symbol search or coding. You have to quickly scan symbols and match them or copy them according to a key.
So speed is key there.
Absolutely. Cancellation is another one like that. These tests make up the processing speed index. And interestingly, scores on these speed tests tend to correlate more highly with each other than with, say, the verbal tests.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge isn't really deep thought, it's doing lots of simple things accurately and very quickly. Unlike some other subtests where the problems get really difficult no matter how much time you have.
Okay, so you do all these 15 subtests. How does that turn into one IQ score?
Right. So performance on each subtest gets scored. Then these scores are grouped together to calculate 4 main index scores.
The domains you mentioned.
Exactly. Verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And then finally, these 4 index scores are combined statistically.
To get the full-scale IQ.
Right.
The number people usually mean when they talk about IQ.
That's the one. It's considered the best single estimate of G, or general intelligence, that the West provides.
And how does that full-scale IQ score usually look across the population? I always hear 100 is average.
That's right. If you test a large representative group, the scores form that classic bell curve, the normal distribution.
Mm-hmm.
The peak of the curve is set right at 100, that's the average. And the standard deviation, how spread out the scores are, is set at 15 for the West.
So most people fall within a certain range.
Yep. About 68% of people score between 85 and 115. That's one standard deviation either side of 100.
Okay.
And about 95% are between 70 and 130, within 2 standard deviations. Only a tiny fraction score way out at the extremes, like above 145 or below 55.
Okay, that gives us a really solid grounding in what intelligence means in research terms and how it's measured. Now, let's shift to something I think a lot of people wonder about. How does it change over our lifespan? You mentioned earlier that older people don't usually feel like they're getting dumber. Is that feeling accurate?
Well, it's common, that feeling. But the scientific evidence, it's a bit more nuanced. People might not subjectively feel a big drop, but studies on cognitive aging, like Timothy Salthouse's work in Virginia.
Yep.
He looked at a big cross-section of adults from their 20s to their 80s, and his findings suggest different abilities change at different rates as we get older.
And cross-sectional means looking at different age groups at one point in time, not following the same people over years, right?
Exactly. That's an important distinction. And what Salthouse found was that things like processing speed, reasoning, some types of memory, they generally tended to decline with age, even when they tried to control for things like people just being less familiar with tests. But other things, like vocabulary knowledge,
That holds up better.
often, yes, it might stay stable or even increase a bit with age.
That sounds a lot like the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. Is that related?
Spot on. That's a really key distinction proposed by Cattell and Horn. Fluid intelligence is that ability to think flexibly, solve new problems, deal with unfamiliar stuff, often quickly. That tends to decline with age.
Right.
Crystallized intelligence is your accumulated knowledge, your vocabulary, general facts, learned skills. That's much more resistant to aging, might even improve.
But they're still connected somehow.
Oh, yes, definitely related. People high in one tend to be reasonably high in the other, but their paths across the lifespan look different.
So it's not like everything declines together. But what about G itself, that underlying general factor? Does that stay stable?
That's a big question. Elliot Tucker-Drob did a really important meta-analysis on this, looking at what he called coupled cognitive changes.
Okay, what did he find?
He pulled together data from 22 different studies, over 30,000 people, tested multiple times over about 10 years on average. Ages range from 35 to 85.
Right.
And his results suggest that, yes, the age-related changes we see in different specific abilities are partly linked to changes in general intelligence in G.
So G itself isn't totally stable.
It seems not. On average, across the studies he looked at, there was an estimated IQ decline of about 7.5 points per decade.
Wow, 7.5 points per decade. That adds up over time. But you also mentioned some incredible studies from Scotland, following people from childhood way into old age.
Yes. The Scottish mental surveys are just amazing. Picture this. June 1st, 1932. Pretty much every single child born in 1921 who was at school in Scotland that day.
How many was that?
An incredible 87,498 children. They all took the same intelligence test, the Murray House test number 12.
Unbelievable. A whole nation of 11-year-olds.
Pretty much. And then decades later, researchers managed to track down hundreds of these same people
No way.
and retested them in their 70s, even into their 90s, using that exact same Murray House test.
Using the same test from 1932. That's wild. What did they find? How did the scores correlate?
The correlations were really quite strong. For the group born in 1921, the Lothian birth cohort, the correlation between their IQ at age 11 and age 79 was around 0.66.
Okay, that sounds pretty high after nearly 70 years.
It is. And even comparing age 11 to age 90, it was still 0.51. It shows a remarkable degree of consistency in where people rank relative to their peers over almost their entire lives.
So knowing someone's IQ at 11 gives you a pretty decent idea of where they'll stand decades later.
A correlation around 0.7, which they found in some of these analyses, means that childhood IQ statistically explains about 50% of the differences, the variance, in old age IQ.
Half the variation explained by your 11-year-old score. That's stunning.
It really is. But of course, it also means about 50% is not explained by childhood IQ.
Right. Other factors clearly play a huge role in how things change as we age.
Definitely. And Deary includes a poignant case study, too. Someone whose scores dropped significantly later in life, who was then diagnosed with early Alzheimer's.
Right.
A stark reminder of how health changes can dramatically affect cognition.
So figuring out what does influence cognitive aging seems like a massive research area. What kinds of things are they looking at?
Oh, everything you can imagine. Diet, exercise, education, job complexity, social life, environmental toxins. You name it.
But it's hard to prove cause and effect, right?
Exactly. Most studies are observational. They find links, correlations, but proving causation is tough. You can't ethically say, assign people to smoke for 40 years to see the cognitive effects. And there's the problem of confounding variables. For example, in the Lothian cohort, people who drank more alcohol tended to have lower cognitive scores at age 70.
Okay.
But does alcohol directly cause that? Or do other things that go along with heavy drinking play a role? It's hard to disentangle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Studying aging is inherently complex. Okay, let's switch gears to another area people often have strong feelings about: sex differences in intelligence. What does the research actually say?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and it's crucial to look at the data carefully, not just rely on stereotypes. That huge 1932 Scottish survey is very informative here.
What did it show for boys versus girls at age 11?
On average, no significant difference in IQ scores between boys and girls.
Really? No average difference?
Nope. But there was a difference in the spread, the distribution of scores. Girls' scores tended to bunch more closely around the average, whereas boys' scores were more spread out. There were more boys at the very high end, but also more boys at the very low end of the IQ range.
So same average.
Yeah.
But more variability for boys.
Interesting. Have other studies found similar things?
Generally, yes. A big U.S. study, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from 1979, looked at teens and young adults, 14 to 22. Similar story. Very small average differences in general intelligence, but some variations on specific subtests. And they could compare brothers and sisters, which helps control for family background.
Right.
And a more recent UK study using the cognitive abilities test in kids aged 11 to 16 actually found a slight female advantage in average general intelligence.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but again, more males at the extremes. Except, interestingly, for verbal reasoning, where more girls scored very high. Okay, so the picture seems to be small or no average differences in G in kids and teens, but maybe some differences in the spread of scores and on specific types of tasks.
That sums it up really well. And Deary makes a really important point. We need to be super cautious about jumping from these small average differences or differences in variability to explaining things like why more men or women are in certain jobs.
Right, that's a whole other complex issue.
Exactly. Understanding occupational differences needs much more specific research. And he mentions later that women might, on average, have other traits, like certain work habits, that help them achieve more academically with the same level of measured intelligence.
That's a crucial nuance. Okay, let's tackle the big one. Nature versus nurture. Genes versus environment. How much does each contribute to intelligence?
Ah, the classic question. Twin studies have been the cornerstone here for a long time. They're like a natural experiment.
Because identical twins share 100% of their genes, but fraternal twins only share about 50%, like regular siblings.
Precisely. So if identical twins are much more similar in intelligence than fraternal twins are, that points towards a genetic influence.
Makes sense.
Researchers use statistics to estimate three components: heritability, gene C squared; shared environment, things twins experience together, C squared, and non-shared environment, unique experiences,
Yeah.
squared. And there are formulas using the twin correlations to estimate these. Like if identical twins correlate at 0.6 for IQ and fraternal twins at zero point 0.4,
Mm-hmm.
a simplified calculation might suggest heritability is around zero point 0.4, twice the difference, 2.60, zero point 0.4. Non-shared environment might be about 0.4, 1 minus the identical twin correlation. And shared environment about 0.2, the identical correlation minus heritability. It gets more complex, but that's the basic idea.
Okay, I follow the logic. So what have these countless twin studies generally found about the heritability of intelligence?
Well, one really striking finding, summarized in Claire Hosworth's huge meta-analysis of over 11,000 twin pairs, is that the heritability of general cognitive ability actually seems to increase pretty linearly from childhood up through young adulthood.
Wait, increase? Heritability goes up as you get older. That seems backwards.
I know, it surprises a lot of people. You'd think the environment would have more and more impact over time.
Right. More experience is more learning.
But what it seems to mean is that as we age and gain more independence, our genetic predispositions might play a bigger role in shaping the choices we make and the environments we seek out, which then further influence our cognitive development. So the genetic differences between people become more apparent in explaining the intelligence differences we see in adults compared to young children.
Huh. So it's not that your genes change, but their influence on the differences between people becomes stronger.
Exactly. It's about explaining the variance in the population. And crucially, heritability applies to populations, not individuals. You can't say my IQ is 50% genetic. That's not what it means.
Got it. Population variance. Now, twin studies aren't the only game in town for genetics, right? You mentioned DNA studies too.
Correct. Genome-wide association studies, GWOS, are a more direct approach. They don't rely on twins.
How do they work?
They scan the genomes of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of unrelated people. They look for tiny variations in DNA code called SNPs.
SNPs.
And see if any specific SNPs are slightly more common in people with higher intelligence scores compared to those with lower scores.
So hunting for specific genes linked to intelligence.
Kind of. A huge GWS with over 300,000 people found 148 independent spots, or loci, in the genome associated with cognitive function.
148.
Yeah, but here's the key thing. Each individual SNP has a tiny, almost minuscule effect on its own.
Ah, so it's not like there's one smart gene.
Definitely not. It's the combined effect of potentially thousands of these tiny variations that contributes to the genetic part of intelligence differences. It's incredibly complex.
Okay, but twin studies also show the environment is important too, especially that non-shared environment.
Absolutely. Those unique experiences always account for a big chunk of the variation. But identifying what those specific environmental factors are, that's been really difficult.
Why is it so hard?
Well, think about all the subtle differences in experiences. Even twins in the same home might have different friends, different teachers, maybe one gets sick, random events. Measuring all that is tough.
True.
We know about some specific negative impacts, like lead exposure. The Dunedin study linked childhood lead levels to lower IQ later on. But for the normal range of intelligence in healthy populations, finding the key environmental drivers is still a major research focus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth adding, heritability isn't fixed. It can differ between populations or environments. Some U.S. studies suggest it might be higher in wealthier families, perhaps because environments are more uniformly supportive, letting genetic differences show through more.
Fascinating. So it's this incredibly complex dance between genes and environment. Let's shift again. You mentioned earlier the idea that maybe smarter people just have faster brains.
Yeah.
Processing speed?
Yeah, that's a long-standing idea. Does higher intelligence come down to more efficient, basic mental processing?
Right.
The 2007 study in Scotland looked directly at this in people aged 30, 50, and 69. They measured reaction times. Two ways. Simple reaction time. Press a button when a light comes on. Pure speed.
Okay.
And choice reaction time. See a number, press the corresponding button. Adds a small decision element.
Right. Slightly more complex. What did they find?
They found a pretty consistent negative correlation between choice reaction time and intelligence scores using the Alice-Heim-4 test.
Negative meaning faster times linked to higher intelligence.
Exactly. People with higher IQs tended to react faster on the choice task, and this link was actually strongest in the oldest group, the 69-year-olds.
Interesting. Even on such a basic task.
Seems so. For simple reaction time, the link was still there, but weaker. But they saw something interesting in the oldest group, something called heteroscedasticity. Basically, for the people with lower IQs, there was much more variation in their simple reaction times. Some were slow, but others were closer to average.
Huh. So maybe aging affects basic speed more variably if you have lower cognitive reserves.
That's one possible interpretation, yeah.
You also mentioned another speed measure, inspection time, from the Lothian study.
Right. Inspection time is different. You see two lines briefly, one slightly longer than the other, then they're masked. You just say which was longer.
Okay.
The trick is they vary how long you see the lines, from 200 milliseconds down to just 6 milliseconds, really fast flashes.
Wow.
And they found that people who could still accurately tell which line was longer, even at those super short presentation times, people with faster inspection times, also tended to have higher IQ scores.
So more evidence for a link between basic processing speed and intelligence. But is that the whole story? Is intelligence just processing speed?
Almost certainly not. Deary is careful to point that out. These correlations are intriguing. They show a link, but correlation isn't causation, right?
Right.
Faster speed might contribute to higher IQ, or maybe a more efficient brain results in both faster speed and higher IQ. Or some third factor influences both. And intelligence involves so much more, like working memory, reasoning, knowledge. Processing speed is likely one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Okay, that makes sense. It's part of the picture, but not the whole picture.
Yeah.
So let's look at the brain itself. What can brain scans, like MRI, tell us about intelligence?
MRI has been a game changer here, allowing us to look at the structure of the living brain and relate it to cognitive abilities. The Lothian birth cohort 1936 study again provides great data, scanning people around age 73.
And what did they find? Does brain size matter?
There is a correlation. They found a modest but consistent positive correlation around 0.31 between total brain volume and general intelligence.
So bigger brains tend to be linked with slightly higher intelligence on average.
On average, yes. And that's been found in other big studies too, like the UK Biobank. But it's not just overall size.
What else?
They also found links with cortical thickness, the thickness of the outer layer of the brain, especially in frontal and temporal lobe areas.
Areas involved in thinking and planning.
Exactly. And also the integrity of white matter.
The brain's wiring.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
The long nerve fibers connecting different brain regions. Better white matter integrity correlated positively with intelligence. And more white matter hyperintensity, sometimes seen as little scars or signs of damage, correlated negatively.
So it suggests that maybe how well different brain areas are connected and communicating is important for intelligence.
That seems to be the idea. People like Roberto Collum talk about an integrated view. It's about both the structure and how efficiently the brain functions and communicates within itself.
Okay, we've dug into what intelligence might be, how it changes its potential biological roots. Let's talk practicalities. Why does any of this matter in the real world? What does intelligence predict?
That's the bottom line for many people, isn't it? And despite controversies around testing, the fact is intelligence scores are surprisingly good predictors of a lot of important life outcomes.
Like what? Education, for example.
Definitely. There's a strong positive correlation between IQ scores and how far people go in school, what grades they get. In the UK, for instance, cognitive ability scores strongly predict performance on national exams like the GCSEs.
Okay, what about getting a job and doing well at it?
Also a strong link. Huge meta-analyses by Schmidt and Hunter looking across tons of studies and different jobs.
Yeah.
Consistently find that general mental ability, or G, is one of the best predictors of job performance. Better than interviews, references, you name it, for most jobs.
Why is that?
The thinking is that people with higher GMA learn job skills faster and adapt better to complex tasks. It seems to be fundamental for performance in many roles.
But surely intelligence isn't the only thing that matters for success.
Oh, absolutely not. Deary quotes Sir Walter Scott. Having intellect is great, but much is required from those who have it. Personality plays a huge role. Conscientiousness, motivation, perseverance, plus opportunity, luck, social skills. So many other factors. But those big longitudinal studies of gifted kids like Lubinsky and Benbow's work.
Following very high IQ kids for decades.
Yeah. They show that kids identified as exceptionally bright are vastly more likely to achieve remarkable things later, major publications, patents, leadership roles in academia, business, law. Intelligence gives a significant advantage, even if it's not the whole story.
Okay, so it clearly matters for education and career.
Yeah.
What about health? You mentioned cognitive epidemiology. That sounds like linking IQ to health outcomes.
Exactly. It's a field asking. Does your intelligence level predict how healthy you'll be, or even how long you'll live?
Seriously. Can IQ predict lifespan?
The evidence suggests yes. Remember that 1947 Scottish Mental Survey testing kids born in 1936?
The ones tested at age 11.
Right. They followed them up to age 79, and they found a clear link. Higher IQ scores at age 11 were associated with a lower risk of dying by age 79.
Wow, that's incredible. For any particular causes of death?
The link was especially strong for things like cardiovascular disease. There was a clear trend. The higher the childhood IQ, the lower the risk of dying from heart disease or stroke.
That is genuinely surprising. Childhood intelligence linked to heart health decades later.
It is striking, and it's not just that one study. A big meta-analysis combined 16 studies, over 1 million people total,
Okay.
and found the same pattern. Higher adolescent IQ linked to lower mortality risk over follow-up periods spanning decades.
Did they account for things like family background? Maybe richer kids were healthier and had higher IQs?
They did. The link remained even after controlling for childhood socioeconomic status. It was reduced somewhat when they factored in later education and adult job status, suggesting those play a role in mediating the link.
But the basic connection between early IQ and later health longevity held up.
It did. The researchers suggest a few possible reasons. Maybe higher IQ reflects better overall body integrity or system integrity from a young age. Or maybe higher IQ leads to better education and jobs, which leads to healthier lifestyles, safer environments, better healthcare access.
Makes sense.
The Lothian study also found higher adolescent IQ was linked to a lower chance of having multiple common diseases like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, arthritis by age 50.
So intelligence seems woven into our overall health and resilience across life. Okay, let's shift to something else that sounds mind-bending. The Flynn effect. What's that about?
The Flynn effect is this observation that average scores on IQ tests have been going up quite dramatically across generations in many countries around the world.
Going up. People are getting smarter.
Well, their scores are getting higher. James Flynn noticed this because test makers constantly had to make the test harder just to keep the average score at 100.
So if I scored 100 on a test today, my grandparents taking that same test back in their day might have scored, what, 80 or something?
Potentially, yes. The gains have been substantial, maybe 20 or 30 points over a century on average, depending on the test and country.
30 points. That's huge. Where are the biggest gains seen?
Often on tests considered culturally reduced, like Raven's progressive matrices,
Yeah.
those abstract visual pattern tests.
Tests that don't rely much on specific knowledge.
Exactly. Which led Flynn to argue that maybe we're not necessarily getting more intelligent in a deep, fundamental way, but we're getting much better at the specific kind of abstract problem solving these tests require.
Why would that be? What's causing the scores to rise?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question. Flynn thought it was environmental, better nutrition, better healthcare, much more schooling, more cognitively demanding environments.
Like modern life just makes us think more abstractly.
That's part of his argument. We live in a world saturated with abstract symbols, categories, hypothetical thinking, scientific reasoning, ways of thinking that were less common a century ago. And that huge meta-analysis by Piechnig and Voracek confirmed these gains are real across different test types, fluid, crystallized, spatial across many countries over about 100 years.
It really makes you question what these tests are truly measuring, if scores can change that much over generations, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That's Flynn's central point. Are we just getting better at playing the IQ test game, or is there a real rise in underlying ability? And if scores change that much, how meaningful are comparisons across long time periods or different cultures? It's a major puzzle.
This brings us into some potentially tricky territory, thinking about group differences and societal implications. The book, The Bell Curve, sparked a huge debate about this, didn't it?
It certainly did. The bell curve, back in the 90s, made some very controversial claims linking IQ, race, and social outcomes, using IQ data extensively.
Right.
The firestorm it created led the American Psychological Association, the APA, to put together a task force. Their job was to kind of summarize what the science actually said about intelligence differences in a balanced way.
What did that APA report conclude? Did it settle the debates?
Not entirely, but it aimed to clarify things. It stressed that intelligence is complex, definitions vary, but tests do measure important mental abilities linked to real-world outcomes.
Okay.
But crucially, it also highlighted big areas where knowledge was still lacking or, as they put it, mysterious.
Like what?
Things like the precise genetic mechanisms, the specific environmental factors, exactly why the Flynn effect is happening, the complex reasons for group differences in average scores, and also understanding other important human qualities, creativity, wisdom, social skills that IQ tests don't capture well.
So even after that major APA report, lots of big questions remained unanswered.
Absolutely. And many of them are still active areas of research and debate today.
It seems like a recurring theme. Now, before we finish, you mentioned Deary emphasizes a couple of statistical ideas, correlation and meta-analysis. Why are they so important here?
They're really the bedrock tools for a lot of this research. Correlation, as we've touched on, just measures how strongly two things are related and in what direction.
Positive or negative from -1 to +1.
Exactly, like height and weight correlating positively, or reaction time and IQ correlating negatively. So much intelligence research relies on finding these patterns, these
But
correlations.
the big caveat is
Correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are linked doesn't mean one causes the other.
right.
But correlations are still super valuable. They give us clues, suggest hypotheses, show us where to look deeper.
And meta-analysis.
That's a way to combine the results from lots of different studies on the same topic. Instead of looking at one study in isolation, you statistically pool them together.
And get a bigger picture.
Yeah, a more reliable estimate of the overall effect. Is there a consistent link between X and Y across many studies? How strong is it? They have limitations, of course, but they're essential for summarizing broad fields like intelligence research.
Okay, that clarifies why those concepts pop up so often. So, wrapping up this incredibly rich deep dive, what are maybe 2 or 3 of the most surprising or just plain intriguing things we've covered?
Oh, wow. Okay. For me, one is definitely that increasing heritability of intelligence as people age. It just messes with your intuition.
Yeah, that one's sticky.
Another is the consistent link between childhood IQ and longevity. That intelligence measured so early seems connected to health decades later. That's profound, I think.
Mm,
And of course, the Flynn effect. The sheer scale of those rising scores just forces you to think hard about what intelligence tests actually capture and how much our environment shapes us.
those are definitely some head spinners.
Yeah.
And hopefully for everyone listening, this journey through the science of intelligence has given you a clearer picture, a faster way to grasp these complex ideas and maybe see how they connect to everyday life.
Absolutely. And, thinking about that intelligence health link, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we understand more about how cognition develops and what influences it, could we use that knowledge somehow to help people live healthier, longer lives? That feels like a really important question to keep pondering.